have on the panel Father Paul Kramer, Dr. Brian McCall, Mr. Michael Semin, and Father Nicholas Gruner, all of whom delivered talks at today's conference. I would like to begin with Father Gruner. Father, in your speech, you touched on the text of the vision released by the Vatican in 2000. And two conference attendees have questions concerning that vision. The first asks, how confident are you that the vision actually is part of the third secret and is not itself a summary or interpretation of the words of Sister Lucy? In other words, is there any reason to doubt the authenticity of the vision?
It was a forensic test done by a group in Detroit, I believe, or Michigan somewhere, which claimed that it was not authentic. I have not followed that. I'm not, shall we say, expert on that question. It seems to me that we've always said that it's been authentic but not complete, that there is a second text. So it certainly to me is, I'm not saying this is a complete interpretation. I agree with Mr. Ferrara that it's too vague or too many ways to interpret it, as has been seen by the many interpretations given already. But I think it certainly clearly gives us, you can interpret it in the context of the message of Fatima, that a pope is killed. He's not just killed, but executed by a group of soldiers. And it's like the King of France was executed by a group of soldiers of the French Revolution, and that our Lord made reference to the King of France, and that what did happen to the King of France, that he was executed by soldiers, would happen to the Pope for their, lack of a better word, disobedience, for their non-fulfillment, non-compliance with the request for the consecration of Russia. And so it ties in, it seems to, that much it seems to tie in with what we know of the message already. So more than that, I don't know if I'd add any more. Thank you.
A second conference attendee has a question about the critique of the Fatima Center of the interpretation given to the vision by the then Vatican Secretary of State, Cardinal Sodano, in the year 2000. The attendee asks, if Cardinal Sodano got it wrong, why didn't Pope John Paul II correct him? To put it another way, does the fact that the Holy Father did not challenge Cardinal Sodano's interpretation of the vision give credence to that interpretation?
Well, I think that, are you asking, this is my question. So first of all, Sister Lucy, if you look at Sister Lucy, when she did not, as a child, when she did not go to school, and Our Lady told her to go to school, and she wasn't going to school, it was because her mother had forbidden her to go to school. And so when she was upbraided publicly about not going to school, Lucy didn't say anything. She was being told, in a certain sense correctly, that she was not obeying Our Lady who told her to go to school to learn to read and write. And yet it wasn't her fault, and she was faulted for this by a priest, I believe, yet she never spoke. I think you have to understand that's a key to Lucy's character, that she never corrected somebody if it was going to embarrass somebody else. And I think this is the same thing. Pope John Paul II did not correct Cardinal Sodano, although the Pope himself gave his own interpretation of the secret more than once. He tells us after or before, I've just forgotten whether Cardinal Sodano's explanation came first or the Pope's homily, but on the same day, at the same time, on May 13th, I was there in the square of Our Lady of Fatima, the plaza there, that the Pope said the message of Fatima is a divine warning to humanity to not follow the third of the stars of heaven and of course the dragon who drags him down to the face of the earth. Now the Pope is known, Pope John Paul was known simply the same way he speaks in 1982, can the mother who with all the force of the love that she fosters in the Holy Spirit and desires everyone's salvation, can she remain silent when she sees the very basis of her children's salvation undermined? the Pope answers his own question. The Blessed Virgin cannot remain silent, but he doesn't tell us that the basis of our salvation that's being undermined is Catholic dogma. He doesn't tell us that it's a third of the stars of heaven which are working for the devil are part of that undermining of our faith. He doesn't say that. I feel he thinks he goes as far as he can without paying consequences that he feels he couldn't avoid. As he spoke about in his both in 1982 consecration and 1984 consecration, he again speaks and repeats, we have done all we can on the basis of our weak human abilities. So he's telling you, I can't do everything, I've done all I can, at least in his estimation, and therefore he doesn't correct Cardinal Sudano. He doesn't tell us what the rest of the details are for the common person to understand. I get his clues, I get his hints, but of course I've been spending my life reading and understanding and getting the message of Fatima in context, but most people don't get it. So that's his style. Why? God knows.
Dr. McCall, in your speech today in which you suggested that the widely accepted idea that there ought to be a separation between church and state is in fact an error of Russia warned about by Our Lady of Fatima, your speech prompted several questions from people in attendance at the conference. One wanted to know whether, since you are opposed to a separation of church and state, are you suggesting that the ideal form of government is a theocracy in a form similar to those found in Islamic nations today?
It's a very good question because it's distinctions that need to be drawn. There are really three, in my mind, distinctions between the proper Catholic teaching on the harmonious relationship between the church and civil society, as Leo XIII described it. And the first of those is the theocracy of the Islamic teaching is a relationship not between civil society and the Church of Jesus Christ, but a relationship between civil society and no church, because of course they don't have a church. And so the first distinction is what they teach is not a relationship between church and civil society, but moving to the second point, really, is a relationship between civil society and a false religion. And obviously that is distinct from what I was explaining as the traditional Catholic teaching. And related to that is that when we understand the role that that relationship is, that's to guard and promote and teach the principles of the natural and divine law, which the church is the guardian of. Now, the role of those principles, as we tried to discuss this morning, is to aid human reason. And so there's a relationship between reason and faith. Remember, God, through the eternal law, wants man to understand. And so faith, the church, the teaching of the church, is meant to clarify the confusion that arose from the wounding from the fall. So it's not meant to be an irrational teaching. Just believe this and don't understand it. It's meant to enhance and make us more able to do what we were designed to do, to have reason. The Islamic teaching is contrary to that. And it's interesting because it is the point that the Holy Father was trying to make in Regensburg, which the media destroyed because they distorted everyone's attention. And he was trying to explain that that was the problem with Islamic understanding of faith, is that it obliterates reason and is a faith without reason. And interesting, some of the media didn't report a very, very small group of Muslim scholars thanked the Holy Father and said, thank you, we've been trying to say this, because the Islamic tradition since the Middle Ages, when they tried to establish philosophy and it was defeated, has obliterated philosophical, reasonable thinking. And the small group actually thanked the Holy Father for what he said. He said, this is what we've been trying to say to our Muslim colleagues. And so that's the second distinction, that what that asks for is an obliteration of reason in light of an irrational faith. And finally, the third distinction is, again, even if you analogize it to a relationship between church and state, remember the relationship that Leo XIII talks about is a relationship where the church and the state are distinct but not separate. So it's distinct but not separate, distinct but related. And the the spheres of operation of the civil society and the church are different. They're distinct, related to the natural and the supernatural ends, but they are related. And when they come into conflict, when there is a decision which impedes the supernatural end, it's in that sense that the civil society is subordinate. Again, the Muslim idea is a subordination of civil ruling authority to their false religion. And so they're completely dominated by it, rather than being supported by making these distinctions and providing this. So it's very, very important because it's used by the enemies of the church's doctrine as a scare tactic. Oh, this is what Muslims want to teach, and that's what you're. And it's not at all. If you look at the true teaching of the church, you can make these clear distinctions.
Thank you, Dr. McCall, for that clarification. Another conference attendee wondered whether certain recent developments, such as the opposition of American bishops to President Obama's contraception agenda and the new Constitution of Hungary, which recognizes the Christian roots of that country, are reasons for optimism that citizens in Western nations are starting to understand that the separation of church and state is problematic.
Certainly they're good signs, but I guess I would echo Father Gruner. Will the record of history say it was too little too late? The American bishops for decades have again taken this approach of hiding behind the wall of separation. We'll leave you alone, you leave us alone. Have not vigorously taught the truths of the natural law regarding the ends of marriage and the intrinsic evil of contraception. And now at the 11th hour, they thank God, have stood up to the president and tried to proclaim Catholic faith. But unfortunately, as they looked around them behind the wall of separation, there was nobody behind them, or very few, because the faithful don't know what they're talking about. The faithful voted, the American Catholics voted for the president in overwhelming numbers. And so, yes, it's a good sign, but it's, to use one of my wife's favorite expressions, it's a little bit like trying to bail out the Titanic with a little bucket after the water has come in. Hungary is a really interesting case, and for those of you who don't know, very briefly, Hungary, which last year, I believe, adopted a new constitution, which makes reference to the teaching of our Lord, the kingship of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that the government is to be in harmony with with our Lord and with the truth. And it's sent somewhat of shockwaves through the European Union because it runs counter to the freedom that the European Union promotes. An interesting freedom of diversity. Hungary tries to be a little diverse and offer a different point of view and gets people a little nervous. What are you being so diverse for? Come be diverse in the one flavor of diversity that we'll allow. Interestingly, and actually I hadn't recalled this, but Mr. Samer pointed out to me that is it the Prime Minister or the President? The Prime Minister of Hungary, who supported this, actually was a Protestant. And again, this is important because the natural law, again, is available to us, and it shows that even someone who doesn't have the fullness can recognize the truth, and in a historical irony, a little better sometimes than Catholics who had the truth but have let it fade into obscurity. So there's some hope there, and it also, in the sense that it offers an answer to an objection, because a lot of people will say, oh, they're real nice ideas the church taught, not practical, can't do it anymore. Well, what's stopping us? I mean, Hungary, certainly not perfect, and it's not the complete truth on the matter, but it is what they've done, and it's been accomplished. And so it shows it can. The only thing that's preventing it is our own fear of trying it.
Mr. Ferrara, you wanted to weigh in on that?
Yeah, we're in a very strange situation, locked in a jail cell to which we hold the key. Because the popular will, turning democracy against itself, could do in America what was done in Hungary. Just a matter of voting. And Brian said something that prompted me to recall a really trenchant remark by that gadfly liberal Stanley Fish. I wrote a book called Liberty, the God That Fell, which is coming out in a couple of weeks, and the theme of that book is that liberalism is a belief system, a creed, and that the states which follow the liberal model are, in fact, confessional states. And what they confess is an anti-theology opposed to the establishment of Christian theology as the soul and the conscience of the state. And so therefore, as Stanley Fish says, liberalism doesn't exist. Think about that. It isn't what it purports to be. Openness to different points of view, toleration for all religions, any concept of the state you wish to advocate, you may advocate. It's all good in the liberal regime. No, it isn't all good in the liberal regime, as we can see from the reaction to what happened in Hungary. So liberalism is just another form of intolerance. And intolerance is indicated where what is being denied toleration is evil. We must be intolerant of evil. Liberalism is intolerant of the good. And because it is so intolerant, it doesn't exist. It is not what it purports to be. And it took a liberal, Stanley Fish, to make that apparent. Liberalism is a fraud.
Dr. McCall, in your speech, you note that there are two sets of needs that man needs to have addressed: his natural needs, which you say are properly addressed by the state, and his supernatural needs, which are properly addressed by the church. In such a vision, does it have to be the Catholic Church that governs man's supernatural ends in civil society, or can it be Christian religious principles in general, or even just general religious principles?
Again, the point is that man has these two goals that God set for him, a natural and a supernatural. And the role of governing authorities is to help man know how to reach those goals. To number one, know what they are, because we are lost in our confusion. And number two, know how to get there. And that is often a matter of determining the right means to those ends. And so to establish the natural, even just on the natural level, the natural end, which is in the Greco-Roman philosophical tradition, the virtuous life described by the word happiness. And there, yes, you can only have an authority infused with the truth, because you're trying to find the truth, to know how to get there. And if you ask someone who has incorrect information, you're not going to get there. I mean, think of an example. I know that I need to find my way from this hotel to the Vatican. And there's someone that lives in Rome, that walks there every day from here, knows how to get there. Or there's a tourist who heard about the Vatican. They don't speak Italian, but their hotel concierge explained it to them in Italian. And I say, well, who should I ask for the directions? Well, I could ask this person that knows, or I could ask this person that has a vague idea. Which one would you choose? And so to get us to those ends, we need the people who have the best information. And we have God's word for it, that his church has the best information. And that's who should help us in making these determinations. So now, could I get the false information, or the incomplete information, and happen to find my way to the Vatican eventually? Yes, but it's not as a result of the bad information. It's a result of something else. Maybe I meet somebody along the way who redirects me. And so I get there in spite of the poor information. So can a vague general principle that happens to correlate with the natural law help? Yes, but if we want to fix things, again, do you want to fix things with someone who says, well, again, take another example, your plumbing's broken. Well, I'm a plumber, I've been doing it for 30 years. Or, well, I kind of looked at this, and I know a few things. I know that water drops because of gravity, and, oh yeah, I want to go with you. No, we want to go with where the truth is. And it's very important because there are a lot of people today who argue, scholars, in favor of natural law. And they say, well, we can just do natural law, but let's not talk about that religion thing, because it's embarrassing, and nobody will listen to us. So we're going to say you can discover the truths of the natural law on your own. Well, we know from the truth you can't. As St. Thomas said, we're wounded. Right? And he speaks himself about it. He says the natural law is knowable by everyone. And he says a lot of things are really obvious, most people know, like stealing is a bad thing. But he points out, he says, when Caesar found the Gauls, they were mistaken about that. They thought that stealing was okay. So he said, left to our own devices, we have this inner voice written on our heart that's directing us, but without direction, we can get a few things right, but we can also get a lot of things wrong. That's why throughout history, we've seen horrible things promoted by governments. Slavery, unjust wars. Because when they didn't listen to the truth, they got it wrong. And so if we're going to propose a solution, if we take the most important element of the solution and hide it under the table and say we don't need it, we're not going to end up at our goal, either our natural or supernatural.
A similar question for you, Mr. Semin, and Father Gruner, I would like your views on this as well. Mr. Semin, in your speech, you argue persuasively that we must live a life of sacrifice if we wish to be saved. One conference attendee wants to know whether, in your view, that sacrificial life has to be a Catholic life. Can a Protestant or even a non-Christian be saved if he or she lives such a sacrificial life in the manner you suggest?
Well, the good human actions, good human deeds, are meritorious on two levels, on natural level and supernatural level. So obviously there are sacrifices we make in our life that are done purely on the natural level. If a mother or father stays during the night not sleeping because the child is ill or something like that, yes, he offers a sacrifice. If Muslim is fasting instead of, overeating or himself, yes, that's a sort of a sacrifice. But so these are sacrifices on purely natural level, and good God will reward these people again on natural level. And for someone who is in the state of sanctifying grace, even these deeds that are considered normally just natural are meritorious on the supernatural level. That is, they lead us towards salvation. So being a Catholic and living a sacrificial life, that's the best way. I mean, that's the right way. We can be morally certain that such a man is really heading for salvation. Regarding non-Catholics, that depends on the possibility of a non-Catholic to live and die in the state of sanctifying grace, which according to the teachings of the Church is theoretically possible, but practically very difficult.
Father Gruner, would you like to weigh in on that?
Well, we have the definition of the Council of Florence, which tells us that even if a person, that one cannot save his soul unless he is a Catholic, and that he stays in the Catholic Church, and that even if he give all his money to the poor, or that if he shed his blood for the name of Christ, but is not in the Church, he cannot get to heaven. And that's a definition of the Church by Eugene IV in 1441 at the Council of Florence. Just to make it very clear, then, can a non-Catholic save their soul? God knows that in the last moments of their life, that if they've done everything with good intention and people have prayed for them, maybe the children of Fatima or one of us listening to the request of Our Lady to pray for the conversion of sinners and offer sacrifice for them, they also can be saved, but by them just accepting the will of God, that in order to be saved, they have to be attached to the vine, and to be attached to the vine, which is Christ, they have to be attached to the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church, of course, there are people who have the idea that unless the Pope or the Bishop or someone else says that they're a Catholic, they're not Catholic. That's not true. There are three things necessary to become a Catholic. One is to have the Catholic faith. Two is to accept Catholic baptism. And three is to accept the legitimate authority of the Pope and the bishops in the Church. Those are the three things necessary: one Lord, one faith, and one baptism. There's no such thing as being a Catholic and being half a Catholic. One is either Catholic or not. One has either got the Catholic faith, one has been baptized, and one has acknowledges the legitimate authority of the Church and of the officials of the Church. That's what it takes to become Catholic, and they can accept this even internally. If they've been baptized already, of course, all they have to do is to accept the Catholic faith and accept the authority that God has given to the Pope and the bishops. The other thing is, of course, the whole doctrine of St. Augustine and St. Thomas talks about the catechumen who wanted to be baptized, who had the explicit desire for baptism, but before his date set for his baptism, he died. He had baptism of desire. And also, of course, those martyrs who were martyred before they could receive the baptism of water, but they wanted explicitly to be baptized with water, but they weren't given that occasion, that God supplied it with the baptism of blood. But yes, baptism, the faith, and maintaining that faith and maintaining that unity. Those what's required to become Catholic.
Dr. McCall?
Just to follow up briefly, because you mentioned St. Augustine, and I love studying history because it gives us so much guidance, and I think the time of St. Augustine is so relevant to the issues now. There's a point where people made some points to St. Augustine about the heretics that he was fighting against, and saying, well, they have some good things. I'll update the language to the jargon now. They have elements of sanctification within them. They have valid baptism. And St. Augustine says, anything they have that's good within them is stolen from the Catholic Church. And so anything they have that is good is not good by virtue of their false religion, but by virtue of where it comes from. And so, yes, it's certainly possible for God to find people to have a way to find their way to the Catholic Church, but it is not through or as a result of falsity or their false religion. It is only through the truth, which is only in the Catholic Church.
This next question is for Mr. Semin, and I'd like Father Kramer's views on this as well, as it also touches on what he raised in his speech. Mr. Semin, in your speech, you suggest that one of the aims of the liturgical reforms after Vatican II was to de-emphasize the sacrificial nature of Holy Mass. And to that end, you quoted Jean Guiton, a friend of Pope Paul VI, who stated that the Pope's aims were to reform the Mass to bring it closer to the Protestants' Lord's Supper. Father Kramer, you note that those changes were prompted by the desire of the conciliar popes to be more ecumenical. Since the Pope is the Vicar of Christ, if these were the conscious intentions behind the conciliar popes' desire and to make the change that they did, what right do we have to challenge such changes in the liturgy?
The first thing I would say is what intention might be lurking inside the Pope's mind is not what concerns us. These intentions were never juridically expressed. Pope Paul VI never mandated the use of any reformed liturgy, any new liturgy. This was a deception that was carried on for decades in the Church. And finally, Pope Benedict XVI declared in his motu proprio, Summorum Pontificum, that the traditional Roman rite of Mass, the Latin Mass that we knew before the Second Vatican Council, was never suppressed, never forbidden. There was no force of law ever given to any kind of suppression of the received and approved traditional rite of Mass.
Perhaps just two small points. First, in the matters of the legislation on liturgy, the Pope is not infallible in liturgical matters. If there is not a particular statement from the Pope that presents it or makes it ex cathedra. Otherwise, because if we look into the history, there were all kinds of liturgical abuses that had to be corrected, and so this is not the first time it was, and because there are many rites in the Church for the Holy Mass and other sacraments. So this is just one of them, which is simply should be revised and should be corrected because of some of the problems that we discussed during the day. And as Father Kramer pointed out in his speech, Benedict XVI is one of those who criticized most openly in the previous years the liturgical reform, and from his own actions, even though he is celebrating the new Mass, we see that he's trying to implement various actions that are that pertain to Catholic tradition and that were lost due to the liturgical reforms after Second Vatican Council. Also, I would just like to add one thing, and that my critique of the liturgical reform doesn't stem from any kind of a subjective judgment, because I don't like that. I was trying to quote from the magisterial documents to see what's the teaching of the Church on liturgy. So that's the criteria we have to take into account, has to be objective, never subjective.
Father Gruner, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, only that I know that Father Paul has written his book, The Suicide of Altering the Faith and Liturgy, which is taken from a quote of Pope, it was Cardinal Pacelli, who became Pope Pius XII, and which Our Lady and Fatima warns against a suicide that is a self-inflicted mortal wound on the Church of changing the faith in the liturgy. And in Father Paul's book, which he didn't talk about, in this, at least this aspect of it, is that it's defined at the Council of Trent in the 7th session, Canon 13, that anyone who says that any pastor of any rank whatsoever has the right to change the received and approved rites into a new rite, let him be anathema. I'm sure Father can explain that better than I, but simply meaning that the right to change the liturgy is limited by the dogma of the Church. Even the Pope is not allowed to do that, because the Pope is called pastor of pastors, and the definition says even the pastor of any rank whatsoever, that includes the pastor of pastors, doesn't have the capacity, does not have the authority from God to change the rite of the liturgy. It has to be the received, that is from the previous generations. What has been given to us has not been received except from the Second Vatican Council. It has to be the received rite coming back from tradition, eventually from the apostles. And this is defined against, and that's why Pope Pius V defines in his quote, Bull Pro Primum, that no one, not even a pope, can change this. I'm talking about the substance now. There are smaller changes that can be allowed. But I'm sure that Father Paul and others can explain this better, but we might as well throw it in there as well.
I think it's important to note that the new catechism makes that very point, that not even the Supreme Pontiff may do as he pleases with the liturgy. That's in the new catechism of the Catholic Church. And since I'm a litigator, I can't resist a zinger. And the zinger is this: for 40 years, traditionalists were ridiculed, mocked, called schismatics for insisting, based on the evidence, that there had never actually been a prohibition of the traditional Mass, because such a thing would be impossible. And Cardinal Ratzinger said such a thing would indeed be impossible. It would be foreign to the spirit of the Church. And now as Pope, he's officially promulgated a document saying that the old Mass was never suppressed. So there.
If I could add one more thing, because an objection that people will raise to the arguments just made is, oh yes, I agree completely, but that's all, there wasn't a new rite created, it was just insubstantial changes. The substance of the Mass was the same. And really behind that objection is a false understanding of philosophy, as in almost every error. And the error is that you can change the accidents, the appearance, as much as you want and not change the substance. And let's just take something we know about the Blessed Sacrament, for example. There you can change some of the accidents. You can break a host in half. You've just changed. An accidental quality would be shape or size. You can change the shape or size, break a host, and not change the substance. But if you take that same host and dissolve it in water, you change the accidents so radically that you change the substance. The real presence is no longer there. And so they take, again, a little bit of truth. Well, you can change some accidents without changing the substance, and they misapply it in this particular case, because if you change enough accidents, you do alter the substance.
And also, if you change accidents in a way that doesn't alter the substance, you still change the appreciation of the substance. Imagine someone going to a job interview in a bathing suit. Would he say, hey, my accidents only have been changed? The man in substance is here, ready to work for you.
I'd like to point out, and I give you the precise quotations, documentation in my book, The Suicide of Authoring to Faith and the Liturgy, that the very men who were commissioned by Pope Paul VI to carry out the liturgical reform, they themselves declared that they have destroyed the Roman rite, that it is a new rite, it is a new creation, and we're talking about the most prominent people in that concilium, which was in charge with the task of reforming the liturgy. And it was acknowledged by Pope Paul VI himself. In November of 1969, he declared that there will be introduced into the liturgy of the Church a new rite of Mass.
One of the conference attendees wonders, since all of the popes since the council have read the Third Secret, if in fact, as you suggest, the Third Secret does negatively refer in a negative fashion to the liturgical changes since the Second Vatican Council, why have those same popes clung so stubbornly to those changes?
That is a question that they must answer to their divine judge.
For Father Kramer, Father Gruner, and anyone else who wants to weigh in on the subject, a sizable number of those relatively few Catholics who still have a devotion to Our Lady believe in her alleged apparitions at Medjugorje. Are there any statements or omissions allegedly made by Our Lady at Medjugorje that contradict those of Our Lady of Fatima, or otherwise can be used to evaluate whether those apparitions are worthy of belief?
Well, the first thing I would say is the apparitions of Medjugorje have been canonically condemned by the church authorities. And I recall that Cardinal Ratzinger himself spoke a very negative judgment against Medjugorje in the most explicit terms, terms that I could only describe, and I agree totally with his with the contempt he expressed for those false apparitions. There are heretical statements that have been made by the supposed whoever she claims to be, certainly not Our Lady at all. Others who have written extensively on this and can give you the precise quotations, I have read them. I have seen the heterodoxy, the explicit heretical nature of some of the statements of the so-called Lady of Medjugorje, or I should say the demon that masquerades as her.
On the question of Medjugorje, first of all, I think that we have to keep in mind the statement of St. Paul in the fifth chapter of First Letter of Thessalonians, chapters 5, verse 19 to 22. Do not extinguish the Spirit, do not despise prophecy, but test all things and hold fast to that which is good. And so the message of Fatima, unlike the message of Medjugorje, has been tested and found to be good, and that's why we're bound to hold fast to it. That is the scriptural injunction for all of us. In the case of Medjugorje, as Father has pointed out, there have been several commissions on Medjugorje. The Bishop of Mostar is the bishop of it's the diocese where Medjugorje is located, and not just one bishop, but I believe several bishops of that same diocese over years, along with all the bishops of Yugoslavia at the time, all but one, have unanimously condemned Medjugorje as not being of supernatural origin. I, of course, make the distinction that the devil is not supernatural, he's preternatural. And there are also reports in favorable books, which I've read myself. I'm talking about, there are books which are against, which also describe this, but there are books which are favorable, who claim that the Blessed Virgin says it doesn't matter what religion you belong to, that you're going to get to heaven anyway. That is a direct act of heresy, a statement of heresy, and is put in the mouth of the person who they claim is the Blessed Virgin. Well, obviously, that cannot be the Blessed Virgin by the simple fact that, just as St. John said, anyone who divides Christ or does not recognize that Christ is God is not the Spirit of God speaking through him. And anyone who denies the dogma of the Catholic faith, which has been defined, also cannot be the Spirit of God. I think that there's also a story, there's an account, I should say, in books which are favorable to Medjugorje, and therefore we're not talking about prejudiced people against it, but you find the story of the devil appearing one day at Medjugorje. At a certain point, the visionary or visionaries, I don't remember the details, make some objection, and then Our Lady appears and said, oh, he shouldn't have been here. The devil transforms himself into Our Lady before their eyes. As St. Paul says, the devil himself can transform himself into an angel of light. And it actually happened in Medjugorje. There's the devil, and before their eyes, they see him transform himself into Our Lady. And excuses, and the person then excuses him, he should not have been here. He was caught before he got dressed up, I guess. But anyway, my point being that there's so much evidence. If you want to read Father Luigi Villa, for example, he's got a whole magazine dedicated to Medjugorje, which he says it is the devil appearing at Medjugorje. He's the premier priest in this country and perhaps in the world, writing about Masonry in the Church, and he very clearly writes, or publishes at least, that Medjugorje is of the devil, clearly. And I think that this is also the role of Medjugorje as not only a distraction from Fatima, but also really a way to draw people away from Fatima. Is quite clearly there was a message given either late last year or early this year in the Medjugorje message that Fatima is good, but now you should be turning to look at me instead of Fatima. It's obviously clearly in direct competition to Fatima. In fact, when the message of Fatima is given, it's only through the requests of Our Lady of Fatima, it's only through obedience to her requests, that nothing else will work. And that has to be understood. But people who don't know Fatima, and they think they're being devoted to Our Lady, have been distracted from the true message of. And that's the same tactic the devil used at Lourdes when Our Lady first appeared. There were 20 false apparitions of Our Lady around Lourdes. And the devil uses that tactic to draw people away from the true apparition by having false apparitions.
Also, the sheer number of apparitions, 10,000 I believe, indicates someone with a lot of time on his hands, which would not be Our Lady of Fatima.
And in one of those thousands of apparitions, the lady, unlike Our Lady of Fatima, in so many of the true apparitions that are approved and recognized by the Church, Our Lady's feet are always visible. But in one of those many thousands of apparitions, the lady did show one of her lower extremities, and one of the seers remarked, "I can see your hoof."
I think another important comparison between the approved apparitions and this one, which is not approved by the Church, is the exemplary life of those visionaries in the approved apparitions. Because if we look at Medjugorje, at the life of some of those visionaries, we don't see much, exemplary lifestyle, building hotels, multi-million-dollar industry all over the world, flying all over the globe, preaching the message of Medjugorje for money. This is not a sign, if we compare it with Lourdes or La Salette or Fatima, that's a complete different mentality. Also, we have some serious moral depravity going on in Medjugorje in the case of some of the Franciscans that were at the beginning of the so-called apparitions, leaving the order, running away with nuns and so forth. So they are alleged proclamations of Gospa, which is the official title of that object that's being present there, and that she pardons this particular priest and understands the situation in which he is and speaks against his bishop and so forth. So all these are signs that it's false.
If I could play my role of the lawyer for a minute and be the devil's advocate to give you an opportunity to respond to what I call the fallback argument when I talk to people at Medjugorje. So listen to all that and they'll say, oh, But I know a person who was a drug addict and really, and they went to Medjugorje and they were converted. They turned their life around. So that's got to be Our Lady.
St. Thomas Aquinas says, God does not will simply the good, nor does he will the evil. But because he is almighty, he has the power, and he wills to draw good from evil.
Is it in Spain, if there is someone from Spain here, where also one of these alleged apparitions happened? Also for a couple of years, everything was like very conservative, and people praying rosaries, and people who came from non-religious background, converted, and so forth, until the leader, I mean the seer, proclaimed himself a pope. He's now one of those, I don't remember the number of these anti-popes running around today, but he's one of them, from Palmar de Troya. That's the place, I think, in Spain. And all these people that were there praying the rosary with their serious, good intentions, are finally in a serious situation, and many of them entrapped, following this false leader of this sect.
I would like to try to get in just 2 questions in the time we have remaining. Mr. Ferrara, there's a priest here who wanted me to put a scenario that, with respect to the consecration to you. He notes that Our Lady appeared in 1917 at the outset of Soviet communism, and that communism fell in 1989 with the falling of the Berlin Wall, and that therefore that is proof that the 1984 consecration of Russia was in fact effective. Might you address his theory?
He would have a point if Our Lady came to prophesy a glorious regime change in Moscow. But she did not come to say, in the end, the regime in Moscow will fall and will be replaced by an autocracy under Vladimir Putin. And the nation that he rules over will still have abortion, child pornography, alcoholism, reality TV that is so obscene I can't even describe it, and will become a decadent consumer democracy, so-called, which is actually an autocracy. No, she came to prophesy nothing less than a metanoia, not only in Russia, but in the Western world, a triumph, as Sochi says, that will be even greater than the triumph at the Battle of Lepanto. That's what a miracle is. A miracle is not a regime change, an improvement of country conditions that the State Department can take note of. It's a radical change of the orientation of the human person toward God and toward the Catholic Church specifically, because Our Lady is speaking of Russia's conversion, and with that, the consequences for the whole of the Western world. And we can see a scenario developing now where that conversion will happen. I'm thinking of the writings of Soloviev, the prophet, mystic, philosopher who wrote at the turn of the 20th century about a great conflagration coming, in which the reunification of the East with the Roman Church would provide the spiritual force to resist an invasion from the East, save the Western world, and bring about a revival of Christianity. And I think that's the only thing Our Lady could be talking about. She doesn't come to promise political improvements, but miracles. We have not seen a miracle in Russia.
I'd like to add one thing, that Our Lady promised the conversion of Russia and world peace, and that without this consecration, peace will not be given to the world. Now, with the provocative actions that have been taking place during this last decade by the Western powers, the predatory nature and imperialistic nature of the provocative actions that have been taken by the NATO forces against Russia have made the Russian foreign minister and the Chief General Makarov of the Russian General Staff, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, have warned that these aggressive wars that are taking place in the world today, being waged by the Western powers, they threaten to coalesce and become a general war and lead to a confrontation between Russia and the United States. General Makarov has been very explicit about that, and most recently, General Makarov has warned that Russia sees such a threat, such an offensive threat in these anti-missile establishments that are being set up in Eastern Europe, that they may preemptively strike them with their own weapons. So this is not the peace that Our Lady promised. This is the war that is threatened if the Pope and the bishops do not comply with her request for the consecration of Russia.
In fact, this thing that the Russian threat is not something that has been hidden somewhere. It's been published actually just a week before we came to this conference. This threat is real. They've been saying, and it's following what I think that the PNAC, the policy of the New American Century, which is a document written, which has been followed by the Bush administration, I believe also the Obama administration, to surround Russia and to isolate it. And the Russians, as Father Paul has pointed to me privately, will not accept being attacked like they waited in the Second World War. They will attack first. That is part of their doctrine. So although everything looks peaceful and calm, and these things are generally not reported in the general press of the West, it is published enough to know. The same thing that China a year ago has warned the United States that if they attack Pakistan, that China will take this as an attack on themselves, and China will retaliate against the United States. That's published in the Indian press, but it's not published in the Western press. For all the news that's fit to print, much of it never gets into our eyes, at least in North America. The European press has a bit more freedom than the American press.
If you have access to it on your television, to Russia Today and to Press TV, those are being suppressed. It's very hard to find Press TV out of Iran, one of the best news stations for news coverage that you will not get in the censored press of the West. The same goes for Russia Today. Not that they aren't slanted, both of them have their own slant, but so much that is twisted, distorted, and suppressed by the Western press is objectively and completely reported by those two news stations, Russia Today with its headquarters in Moscow, and Press TV in Tehran.
And that is, I think Chris is right. There was some political improvement, and there were some people helped by the fall or the regime change. But let's not forget how generous Our Lady is and how merciful she is. And she said, if you consecrate Russia, Russia will be converted. And that didn't happen. But the Pope did do something. In his own words, he did all he felt he could do. He prayed and he consecrated the world. And Our Lady's generous. So she's not going to give what she promised upon her condition, but perhaps she did do something that the good Father's noticing in the problem. So she made a little improvement while she still waited for the big change. And so if we remember how merciful she is, that may explain the bit of a change that we did see.
Also, there is a positive development that could be in remote preparation for Russia's conversion, which is the revival of sorts of the Orthodox Church. In terms of the Church, the Orthodox Church, becoming once again an instrument of the Russian state, a vehicle for nationalization, but that does involve having them instruct children in the schools and the Orthodox religion, even though 95% of Russians don't practice the faith. So the apparatus has been put in place for a reunification with Rome, even though, as I say, the Orthodox Church, as it has been since the time of the Russian Revolution, remains an instrument of the Soviet or post-Soviet state. Nevertheless, it's in place for the conversion of Russia. So that is something positive.
We have time for one last question, and have to limit it because of time to you, Father, if you would answer this one final question. In your speech, you spoke of the need to proclaim the truth, no matter what the consequence. One priest in attendance wondered how far we should go in that regard. Should a bishop or priest living under an oppressive government recommend that the faithful under his care act in such a way that, while it may conform with God's law, may result in persecution or suffering for those faithful, or even civil war within such a country?
Well, I'm sure the question deserves an answer. We have the example of martyrs, some of, for example, St. Sebastian, who was in the Praetorian Guard of the Caesar at the time, and he denounced the persecution to Caesar's face, and of course suffered martyrdom for it. In fact, he was recovered from his wounds the first time. He came back to denounce them a second time, and then was denounced. And Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who also denounced the emperor or whoever was in Alexandria, again at the cost of her life. And she's, of course, I think she's in the canon of the Mass as well. Her feast is the 25th of November. And so some saints certainly have taken that because they've been heroic in their defense of the faith and defense of the truth, and they're to be admired and no doubt emulated to the extent that God gives us that grace. On the other hand, when I'm speaking about the truth, we're not speaking about persecution. I meet a lot of afraid priests and a lot of afraid bishops. The worst that's going to happen to them is someone might not invite them to dinner next time. The worst that's going to happen to them is that someone's going to snicker at them because they spoke about the consecration. And this kind of truth, to speak up for that, to not worry about if we don't speak up for the truth, if we could say, well, let someone else do it, then if to not defend the truth, I think it's again St. Felix, but whoever it is, one of these popes, tells us that we are then as guilty of those who tell the lie. If we are not going to defend the truth of the consecration, of the message of Fatima, of the seriousness of the third secret, of the fact, if you're convinced of it, that the secret has not been released, then we have only ourselves to blame that we have this going on in the church. The enemies of the church are the ones counseling the Pope. The enemies of Our Lady are the ones counseling the Pope. And our voice is not heard. It's not even considered. It's not considered because, I think Brian here put it earlier, we cannot get out of our own prison because we are afraid, we're even afraid to pick up and take the first step ourselves, lest we be laughed at or stopped or shunned or socially turned off or whatever it is we're afraid of, or maybe we won't get an extra stipend or something. I'm not quite sure what it is, but it really is shameful, the amount of lack of courage that we have in not defending the message of Fatima. And I'm not asking you to go to martyrdom, although God may be calling you to do that. And if we don't defend it, we will be called to martyrdom for our omission for not defending it beforehand.